The highway was silent, its darkness absolute. Only the low hum of my truck and the occasional crackle of the CB radio kept me company as I drove through the desolate stretch of Montana. After 15 years on the road, I'd seen just about everything, or so I thought. But that night, under a moonless sky, I discovered a horror that refuses to leave me. A memory so vivid it still sends icy tendrils crawling down my spine. I was running on fumes when my company admitted they botched the mileage calculation. The closest gas station was over an hour away, far off the beaten path. Frustration simmered, but I had no choice. I veered off the main highway onto a narrow, unlit road that snaked through an abyss of trees and emptiness. The air felt different as soon as I left the main route, colder, heavier, as if the darkness carried a weight of its own. For nearly an hour, I didn't see a single vehicle. My headlights carved weak tunnels through the void, but beyond them the world seemed to dissolve into nothingness. And then I saw it. A shape loomed ahead, barely illuminated at the edge of my high beams. My foot eased off the gas instinctively. At first I thought it might be an animal, a deer perhaps, but as I got closer, the shape grew stranger, more grotesque. My pulse quickened. When the realization struck, it hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't an animal. I slammed on the brakes, the truck groaning to a halt. My heart raced as I leaned forward, trying to comprehend what lay before me. The thing was a mass of flesh and bone, headless and skinless, sprawled unnaturally in the middle of the road. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something compelled me to step outside. Grabbing my flashlight with a trembling hand, I exited the cab. The cold night air clawed at my skin, unnaturally biting for summer. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the gruesome sight. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, landing squarely on the grotesque figure. It was worse than I'd imagined. The ribcage was disturbingly intact but misshapen, the bones grotesquely warped as though twisted by some malicious force. Ligaments dangled, barely tethering the structure together. The smell hit me next, a nauseating wave of decay that churned my stomach. I stood frozen, unable to look away. Was it human? Animal? Some twisted hybrid of both? My mind struggled to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. Reaching for my phone, I cursed as the screen showed no service. I was utterly alone. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, a soft rustling carried on the still air. I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the road. At the edge of the darkness, a cluster of eyes gleamed back at me, reflective, predatory. Coyotes. There were 5, maybe 6 of them, their silhouettes low and menacing. They didn't bark or howl, just watched. The silence was suffocating. Slowly they began to move, their bodies weaving in and out of the flashlight's beam as they crept toward me. Panic surged through me, my instinct screamed to run. My boots pounded against the gravel as I sprinted back to my truck, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each stride. The chill in the air seemed to grow sharper, biting at my exposed skin as if urging me to move faster. I reached the cab, throwing the door open and launching myself inside. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut and locked it. My trembling fingers fumbled to put the truck in gear. I didn't look back. The engine roared as I sped down the desolate road, leaving the twisted pile of bones and the eerie predators far behind. My headlights cut through the endless black, but I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching me from the shadows. I didn't stop at the gas station. I didn't care about the fuel. I just kept driving until the lights of civilization finally pierced the void. Even now I can't explain what I saw. It wasn't just the grotesque remains or the unnerving presence of the coyotes. It was the air itself. The oppressive cold, the unnatural stillness, the sense that I was trespassing on something ancient and malevolent. To this day, whenever I drive through Montana, I can't help but glance at the empty roadsides, half expecting to see another pile of warped bones staring back at me. And sometimes, late at night when I close my eyes, I still hear the rustle of those coyotes and feel their eyes boring into me, as though they're waiting for me to return. Whatever I encountered on that desolate stretch of highway, I hope I never find it again. But deep down, I know it's still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for its next visitor. Some nights on the road stay with you forever, not because of the miles driven, but because of the shadows you encounter. I never believed I'd carry the weight of someone else's despair, but here I am, years later, still haunted by a night that felt more like a glimpse into someone else's living nightmare. It was a quiet run through the Canadian Rockies, the kind of solitude I usually welcomed. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless black ribbon, and the only company I had was the occasional flicker of my headlights against the jagged silhouette of the mountains. I had just passed a speck of a town, more like a memory on the map, and the roads were completely deserted. The night felt wrong. There was a stillness, a heaviness in the air I couldn't shake. At first I chalked it up to exhaustion. Long hours on the road tend to play tricks on your mind. My bladder reminded me it was time for a break, so I slowed down and pulled over on the shoulder. With nothing but the forest's inky blackness around me, I stepped out into the freezing air to take care of business. That's when I first noticed it. The silence. It wasn't the typical quiet of a mountain highway. It was oppressive, unnatural, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. I lit a cigarette to calm my nerves, watching the smoke curl lazily into the still air. And then, just beyond the edge of my headlights, movement. A figure emerged from the forest. At first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear or an elk. But no, this was human. A man, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of the world were pressing down on him. My breath hitched. What the hell was someone doing out here, miles from anywhere, walking out of the woods in the dead of night? I froze, my cigarette burning forgotten between my fingers. The man's silhouette was gaunt, his movements unsteady but purposeful. Something about him gnawed at the edges of my mind. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck. I didn't wait to find out if he meant harm. I hurried to the cab, locking the door behind me, my eyes never leaving him. He was getting closer now, stepping into the harsh glare of my headlights. That's when I saw his face, pale, gaunt, eyes bloodshot and hollow, like he hadn't slept or felt alive in days. His clothes were tattered, damp from the night, and in his hand he clutched a kitchen knife. My stomach turned. He walked straight up to my passenger side window and knocked. Not aggressively, but firmly. A deliberate sound that made my chest tighten. Against every better judgment, I cracked the window just enough to hear him. "What's going on?" I managed, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound composed. He didn't answer at first, his bloodshot eyes fixed on something distant, as if he were looking straight through me. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost mechanical. "I need you to call the cops." The words hit me like ice water. My first thought was to ask why, but something about the knife in his hand made me hesitate. Instead, I reached for my phone, all the while keeping one eye on him. "What happened?" I asked cautiously, the screen of my phone illuminating my shaking hand. He didn't look at me when he answered. His voice was flat, void of emotion. "I went into the woods to end it." A cold chill swept over me, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. He went on to explain, his words mechanical but laced with something raw and desperate. He'd gone out there to take his own life, but at the last moment he thought of his daughters. It was their faces, their laughter, their need for him that pulled him back. My heart clenched. I didn't know what to say. Here was a man, shattered and broken, standing at the edge of the abyss, and I was his tether to this world. I forced myself to stay calm. "Leave the knife on the ground," I said quietly. "I'll call someone to help." He didn't argue. The knife clattered onto the pavement, its metallic ring cutting through the stillness. He stood there, shoulders trembling, silent tears streaming down his face. The wait for the police felt endless. Every second stretched unbearably long, the weight of his despair hanging in the air. When the distant wail of sirens finally reached us, relief washed over me. Before they took him away, I asked if I could speak to him one last time. Standing next to him, I searched for the right words. I told him I hoped he'd find a way out of the darkness, that there was still a chance for him to rebuild. He didn't respond, but as the officers led him to the squad car, he glanced back at me. For a brief moment I saw something flicker in his hollow eyes. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe hope, or maybe it was just my imagination. As I pulled back onto the highway, the flashing red and blue lights disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the weight of the encounter stayed with me. I think about him often. Did he find his way out? Did he make it back to his daughters? Or did the darkness win in the end? I'll never know. But I'll always remember the look in his eyes that night, a haunting reminder of how fragile we all are. It began with the wind, sharp, howling, and relentless, carrying with it a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The kind of unease that crawls into your chest and nests there, feeding on the silence of an empty highway. I'd been driving trucks long enough to know the strange rhythm of the road, the solitude that comes with endless miles of darkness. But that night something was different. Something I still can't fully explain. The road stretched out before me, barren and endless, cutting through the flat, desolate land of eastern Washington. The only company for miles was the occasional groan of the truck engine and the whistling wind outside. It was late, too late to keep going safely. My eyelids were heavy, and exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my focus. So I pulled off onto one of those dirt turnouts that dot these forgotten stretches of highway. No rest stops, no gas stations, no signs of life. Just me, my rig, and the kind of stillness that feels like it's watching you. I parked, locked the doors, and closed the curtains of my sleeper cab. Settling in, I pulled out my phone, trying to drown the uneasy quiet with a mindless show. Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying grains of dirt that scratched faintly against the truck's surface. But after about an hour, something changed. The air seemed heavier, charged, and then I heard it. A tap. It was faint, deliberate, like a fingernail gently rapping against the driver's side door. My breath hitched, and for a moment I froze. I hadn't seen or heard another vehicle for hours. The road was deserted. Slowly I sat up, straining to listen. Then it came again. On the passenger side this time. A rhythmic, almost taunting sound of someone testing the door handle. Every muscle in my body tensed. This wasn't the wind. My pulse pounded in my ears as I peered through a narrow gap in the curtain, scanning the pitch-black surroundings. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of dirt and scrub under the dim glow of the moon. I wanted to believe it was nothing, an animal maybe, but deep down I knew better. The feeling clawing at my gut told me I wasn't alone. I started the truck, flooding the area with headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. No figures, no movement, just the barren landscape. But the unease didn't fade. I locked the doors again, drew the curtains tighter, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Exhaustion could play cruel tricks. Then came the scraping. It started softly, like nails on metal, coming from the sleeper vent above me. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, growing louder and more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to pry it open. I hit the panic alarm inside the cab, hoping the sharp noise would scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. But the scraping only stopped for a moment before something else started, tapping on the windows. Slow, methodical, like tiny fingers playing a twisted game. Then I felt it. The truck shifted. Its suspension groaned under the weight of something climbing onto it. I held my breath, paralyzed, as the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps moved along the roof. My instincts screamed at me to drive, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't. Fear rooted me in place. I clutched the steering wheel, heart pounding, as the steps stopped directly above me. The silence that followed was deafening, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. That's when I saw them. Handprints. They were smeared across every window of the truck, small, human-like, and streaked in slow, deliberate circles. My stomach churned as I stared at them, their size making it clear. They didn't belong to an adult. I scanned the dirt around the truck, desperate for an explanation, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Yet the handprints remained, stark against the glass, a chilling reminder of what had happened. I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me, and drove away without looking back. I didn't want answers anymore. Some things are better left unknown. Even now, when I think of that night, my skin crawls. The isolation of the road, the howling wind, the eerie stillness. It all feels like a part of something much darker. Something I'll never truly escape. Because in the quiet hours, when I'm alone on the road again, I can't help but feel that I was never really alone that night. And maybe, just maybe, I never will be. It's not the first time I've been stranded on a quiet stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, but that night, something changed. The moment my truck's engine sputtered to silence, I knew deep down I wasn't alone. The eerie stillness of the night wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something waiting. And it wasn't until I heard the first child's cry that I realized how deep that presence went. It was a cold night, late November. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and clings to you. The wind cut through my jacket as I rolled through the endless highway of rural Kentucky. I was working for Costco at the time, driving one of those massive rigs loaded with toys. It was the holiday season, busy, tiring, the roads filled with shipments of dolls, trucks, and all kinds of presents headed to every corner of the country. But this load was odd. A truckload of Spider-Man dolls, all of them towering, stuffed superheroes destined for somewhere deep in the heart of nowhere. I chuckled at the thought. Spider-Man dolls of all things. But it was late, and I had a job to do. I'd been at it for years, making these long hauls, and nothing ever rattled me. Until this night. I was pushing through I-265, making good time despite the hour, 2:30 a.m., and I was alone on the road, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. After about an hour it started. That feeling, the one you can't explain but know deep down that something isn't right. I brushed it off, fatigue creeping in as I popped a couple of no-dose pills and pressed on. But then the fog rolled in, and this wasn't your normal fog. It wasn't misty and mild. This fog was thick, like a suffocating blanket, pressing against the truck, smothering everything in sight. I could barely see beyond a few feet. I slowed down, my headlights useless against the wall of mist. Something about it felt wrong. I'd been driving these roads for years, but this felt different. The world outside disappeared into nothingness. After about 15 minutes of inching along, I decided to pull over. No cars in sight. The road was deserted. Strange, given how much traffic I usually saw at this time, but I was ahead of schedule, so I figured I'd wait it out. Engine off. The truck sat in silence, and I listened. There was nothing, just the occasional rustle of distant trees swaying in the wind. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. And then, just as I was starting to relax, it happened. The truck went dead. It wasn't like the engine sputtered out or the lights flickered. No, it was as if someone had simply flipped a switch. The dashboard went black, the headlights dimmed, and the truck was silent. I twisted the ignition, tried restarting it, but nothing. I reached for my CB, static. I checked my phone. No signal. Absolute silence. Panic surged like ice through my veins. What the hell was going on? This was a major road, one I'd driven countless times, and never had I been stuck like this. I looked out at the road, wondering if I was in some twisted dream, but the reality hit me with a cold slap. That's when I heard it. A child's cry. Faint at first, like the soft sobs of a small child carried on the wind. My heart skipped, my breath caught. I'd been out here for years, and never heard anything like it. The cry, growing louder, made my blood run cold. But then, something changed. The sound morphed. It wasn't a child sobbing anymore. It became something darker, something more unsettling. A woman's sobs, ragged and hollow, twisting the air around me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. My hand gripped the door handle instinctively. I've faced danger before. Big guy, 6'3", 250 pounds. But in that moment I felt tiny, helpless. Is anyone out there? Do you need help? I called out, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound calm. As if on cue, the crying stopped. For a split second I thought maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came. An eerie, mocking laugh. Not a friendly laugh. Not a nervous chuckle. It was deep, sinister, and bone-chilling. It wasn't just any laugh, it was a laugh directed at me. I rolled the window up fast, heart pounding, but that laugh only grew louder, more mocking. It echoed in my skull, the sound so intense it felt like my head might explode from the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. I sat frozen, wide-eyed, sweat trickling down my face, every muscle stiff. What the hell just happened? The truck, as if possessed by some unseen force, roared back to life. The headlights flickered, the engine hummed back to life as if nothing had happened. The fog, the oppressive fog, began to dissipate, swirling away like it had never been there. Without thinking, I slammed the truck into gear and floored it. I couldn't get out of that place fast enough. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the wheel, eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. By the time I reached the nearest truck stop, I was a wreck. I parked the rig, my legs barely able to hold me up. I scrambled out of the truck, fumbling for my keys, and bolted straight to the bathroom. Splashing cold water on my face, I tried to calm myself down. But I couldn't shake the thought, did that really just happen? I kept asking myself if I was just tired, hallucinating, if the lack of sleep was finally catching up with me. But deep down, I knew. That night, out there on that desolate road, something had happened. Something real. I've driven that same stretch of road countless times since. Every time I pass through, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The laughter, still there, echoing in my mind. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to return. I don't know if it was the wind or the silence that unsettled me most, but as I rolled down that desolate stretch of road in the Texas Panhandle, I felt something I hadn't before, like the land itself was holding its breath. The air was heavy, thick with that ceaseless wind that never seemed to stop, a gusting force that rattled the rig and kept me at the mercy of the road. It was late spring, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a dim twilight glow. I was third in line on that empty highway, following a cattle hauler ahead of me, with another truck trailing behind. The road was wide, open, barren, the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. In a way, it was peaceful. In another, it felt too quiet. The wind was vicious that night, pulling at my rig, making it impossible to keep the truck in top gear. I've driven these roads 100 times, but tonight, the wind felt like it had a mind of its own, almost like it was trying to push me off course. I could barely get traction, my truck fighting against it like an animal trying to escape a cage. I focused on keeping my distance from the hauler, hoping the weather would let up. But then, something caught my eye. The cattle hauler ahead of me, a large truck hauling dozens of heavy animals, was drifting dangerously to the right. I couldn't tell if the driver had lost control or if the wind had taken over, but his front tire hit the berm hard, sending the truck swerving to the left. He tried to correct, but the gusts were too much, and the truck leaned violently. The trailer shifted under the weight of the animals, the cows inside panicking. I watched in helpless horror as the rig tilted further, inches from disaster. Then, bam, the truck hit the berm again. Tires screamed, the sound of metal grinding against the earth rang in my ears, and just like that, the truck flipped. It happened fast. The truck rolled over, crashing violently into the gully below. The trailer's shrieks of agony filled the air as it came to a sudden, unnatural stop. For a moment everything was silent. Too silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed my brakes and pulled over. The truck ahead of me was already slowing, and I heard a shout over the CB. "He's going over, man!" I didn't hesitate. My hands were shaking as I jumped out of the cab, adrenaline coursing through me. The wind howled like it was trying to swallow us whole as I sprinted toward the wreckage. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I ran toward the overturned truck, and that's when it hit me. The smell. It wasn't just the scent of twisted metal and leaking fuel. It was the stench of death. I couldn't even process it at first, my mind racing to get to the driver. But then I saw them. Cows, 3, maybe 4, had been flung through the crumpled roof of the trailer, their lifeless bodies sprawled across the dirt. Their eyes were wide, glassy, unblinking. Some were dead, others twitching. Their last breaths were hanging heavy in the air like the very atmosphere was suffocating them. The rest of the cattle were still inside the trailer, bellowing in terror. The sound was deafening, their hooves rattling against the metal, panicked beyond reason. Every kick of their hooves seemed to echo with the chaos they were trapped in. But it wasn't the cows that sent chills down my spine. It was the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. Something felt wrong. I forced myself to focus on the driver. He was struggling inside the cab, trying to crawl out, but the truck was leaned at such an angle that he couldn't reach the door. The other trucker, a big guy in a battered Peterbilt, ran up beside me, and we both scrambled, trying to reach the driver. Yet my mind kept going back to the trailer. Those cows. They were too frantic, too terrified, and something about it all felt unnatural. I didn't want to look inside the trailer. I didn't want to see what awaited me there, but I had to. And when I peered through the broken metal, the horror I saw nearly paralyzed me. Bodies, crushed, broken, lay scattered across the floor of the trailer. Some were still breathing, their shallow, wheezing breaths barely audible. Others were already lifeless, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. The rest were crammed in, packed tightly together, desperate to escape, but there was no escape. The terror in their eyes mirrored the driver's. I couldn't do anything. I felt powerless, as helpless as the animals trapped in that mangled metal tomb. The other trucker must have seen the look on my face, because he said he would run for help. There was no cell service out here, no way to reach anyone, so I stayed behind with the driver, trying to comfort him as best I could, though neither of us knew what to say. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, before help finally arrived. A sheriff's deputy pulled up, his face stern, his gaze colder than the wind. He took my statement, then looked over at the trailer. When I asked about the cattle, about the ones still alive, his response sent a shiver down my spine. "You should leave," he said, his voice sharp. But it wasn't the words. It was the look in his eyes, the kind of look that said, "I don't want to know either." I didn't question it. I climbed back into my truck, my hands still trembling, and started the engine. The weight of the moment pressed on me, and as I drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The wind still howled around me. My heart was racing, and the images of those cows, those wide-eyed, terrified creatures, still haunted me. And then came the sickening realization. I shouldn't have asked about the cows, because the answer, whatever it was, would stay with me forever. I haven't been back to that stretch of road since, and every time I drive past it I can still hear their cries. The wind still whispers their fear. I don't know what happened to them, but sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting.